to right field. To the corner goes Fernando. At the